A man crouches in the limestone dust outside Jericho's eastern gate, his hands cupped upward, his eyes fixed on the ground. He has not eaten since yesterday. The single denarius he earned hauling stones to a rich man's courtyard, the same wage Jesus would later call a fair day's pay in his parable of the vineyard workers, bought him 12 loaves of coarse barley bread, and he split them with his wife and 4 children, keeping nothing for himself. This morning his hands are empty again, and in a few hours the sun will be unbearable, and the work may or may not come. This is not a story about poverty in the abstract. This is the story of what your life actually looked like at every level of biblical society in the year 33 AD. From the beggar who crouched in the dust outside the temple gates to the man who sat on a golden throne and called himself a god. And what makes this story devastating is not the distance between those two lives. It is how precisely Jesus moved through every single layer of this world, touching each one, and what it cost him to reach the very bottom. Start here, at the bottom, because that is where most people lived. Roman census records and modern demographic reconstruction converge on a single staggering number. Roughly 70 to 75% of the population of first-century Judea were subsistence peasant farmers. 3 out of 4 people you would pass on any road in Galilee or Judea were surviving on approximately 1 denarius per day. Not thriving, surviving. That single silver coin, smaller than a modern dime, stamped with the face of Tiberius Caesar, represented the razor-thin margin between eating and not eating, between keeping your children alive and watching them weaken. 1 denarius bought about 2 kilograms of meat or a dozen loaves of bread. Choose one. You cannot have both. And if you were sick, if the rains failed, if a Roman tax collector appeared at your door with a revised assessment, that margin vanished entirely. The Hebrew term for these people, the vast, invisible majority of the biblical world, was Em Haaretz, people of the land. And the way the religious elite spoke about them will turn your stomach. The Talmud preserves the words of Rabbi Eliezer, who declared it permissible to stab an Am Haaretz even on Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the year. Another ruling warned that no man should marry the daughter of an Am Haaretz because, and this is a direct quote, they are like animals. This was not fringe opinion. This was the educated religious establishment describing the people who grew their food, built their houses, and paved their roads. They were considered so ritually unclean, so hopelessly ignorant of Torah, that contact with them was treated as contamination. Hold that in your mind, because when the Gospels tell you that Jesus ate with sinners, that he touched lepers, that he sat down with tax collectors and prostitutes, they are not describing mere social awkwardness. They are describing a man who deliberately, repeatedly, publicly violated the deepest class prejudice of his entire civilization. Every shared meal was an act of defiance. Every touch was a declaration. Now step down one more level. Below the peasant farmer, below the day laborer waiting at the marketplace for someone to hire him, there existed a world of total destitution that most modern readers glide past without feeling. The Greek language had 2 different words for poverty, and the distinction matters more than almost any other linguistic detail in the Gospels. The word pines described a working poor person, someone who labored for subsistence, who was broke but functional. But the word Luke uses in the Beatitudes when Jesus says, "Blessed are the poor," is not pines, it is tokos. And tokos comes from the root tosin, which means to crouch, to cower, to shrink back in fear. A tokos is not someone who works and has little. A tokos is someone who has nothing at all. A beggar who crouches on the ground, utterly dependent on the mercy of strangers, with no safety net, no family to fall back on, no legal standing. When Jesus said, Blessed are the Tokos. His listeners understood exactly what he meant. He was not romanticizing modest living. He was pronouncing divine favor on the crouching, terrified, invisible people that the rest of society stepped over without seeing. And we know where those people gathered. The Gospel of John describes the pools of Bethesda in Jerusalem with a specificity that skeptics once dismissed as fictional. 2 large pools surrounded by 5 covered colonnades. No such structure was known. Then archaeologists put shovels into the ground north of the Temple Mount and uncovered exactly what John described. 2 enormous pools with 4 covered walkways around the perimeter and a 5th colonnade dividing them down the middle. The architecture was real. The 5 porticos were real. And under those stone coverings, the disabled and destitute of Jerusalem gathered in such numbers that the site functioned as an open-air infirmary. The sick, the blind, the paralyzed, people who had no physician, no family with resources, no option except to lie beside the water and hope. When Jesus walked into that colonnade in John chapter 5 and healed a man who had been lying there for 38 years, he walked into the most concentrated pocket of human misery in the entire city. He did not send a messenger, he went himself. The God of the universe walked into the place that smelled the worst, looked the most hopeless, and contained the people everyone else had abandoned. The Creator entered the room no one else would enter. Now rise with me through the layers. Above the beggars and the subsistence farmers, there existed a class of skilled workers. And here is where the story of Jesus' own family becomes far more interesting than most people realize. The Greek word used for Joseph's profession in Matthew 13:55 and for Jesus himself in Mark 6:3 is tekton. For centuries we have translated this as carpenter. But tekton does not mean carpenter. It derives from a root meaning to produce, to create. And Aristotle used the same word to describe builders generally. In 1st century Galilee, a region with very few trees where timber had to be imported from Lebanon at enormous expense, a tekton primarily worked limestone. He built walls, he carved door frames, he installed roof beams. He was closer to what we would call a general contractor than a man who made tables and chairs. The hands that would later be nailed to a Roman cross had spent years cutting stone, mixing mortar, lifting beams, and those hands almost certainly commuted to work. Just 6 kilometers from Nazareth, 1 hour on foot, stood the city of Sepphoris, and this is a place most Christians have never heard of despite its extraordinary significance. Excavations at Sepphoris revealed a major Romanized city under active construction during the exact years of Jesus' childhood and young adulthood. A 4,500-seat theater, colonnaded streets in the Roman style, elaborate mosaic floors, wealthy villas with painted walls. The construction boom at Sepphoris would have drawn every tekton in the region, and Nazareth was the closest village. The probability that Joseph and Jesus walked that road each morning, spent their days building a Roman-influenced city, and returned each evening to their modest village home is not speculation. It is near certainty. Think about what that means. Jesus did not grow up in isolation. He grew up walking daily between 2 worlds, the humble Jewish village and the cosmopolitan Roman city. He knew the sound of Greek being spoken in the marketplace. He knew the sight of Roman architectural ambition. He knew exactly what imperial power looked like because he helped build its local expression with his own calloused hands, and he walked away from all of it. Every stone he laid in Sepphoris was a palace compared to the kingdom he chose. A tekton in Galilee likely earned more than the bare denarius of a day laborer, perhaps 2 to 3 denarii per day for skilled work, comfortable by the standards of the time. But to understand what comfortable meant in this world, you need to see it against what existed above. The centurion who approached Jesus in Matthew chapter 8, the Roman officer who said, "Lord, I am not worthy for you to come under my roof," that man earned between 3,750 and 5,000 denarii per year. Roman military records preserved on papyrus in Egypt give us the precise salary structure. A common legionary under Tiberius earned 900 sestertii annually, roughly 225 denarii. But after the army deducted costs for food, equipment, boots, and the compulsory burial fund, a soldier took home perhaps 100 denarii in actual spending money. The centurion, commanding 80 men, earned 15 to 20 times that amount. He was the equivalent of an upper-middle-class professional in the modern world. He could afford servants. He could build a synagogue for the local Jewish community, which Luke 7:5 tells us this particular centurion did. And yet this man, this Roman officer with real authority, real income, real social standing, knelt before a Jewish tecton from a village so insignificant it appears in no Roman record, no Greek geography, no document of any kind outside the Gospels. He knelt and said he was not worthy. Jesus' response was astonishment. The text says he marveled. In all of Israel, he said, he had not found faith like this. The man with power recognized power. The man who commanded soldiers recognized command. Now climb higher, far above the centurion, above the merchant class, above the minor aristocracy. There existed a financial operation in Jerusalem that would stagger most modern believers. The temple was not merely a place of worship. It was a treasury of almost incomprehensible scale. The Mishnah records that every Jewish male over the age of 20 paid a half-shekel temple tax annually. With an estimated 4 to 6 million Jews spread across the Roman Empire, this single tax generated approximately 2 to 3 million denarii per year, flowing directly into accounts controlled by the high priest. Caiaphas did not merely preside over sacrifices. He managed a financial operation comparable to a modern central bank, and the revenue streams extended far beyond the tax. The money changers. Jesus drove from the temple courts operated currency exchanges at commission rates scholars estimate between 4 and 8%, processing transactions for the 2 to 3 million pilgrims who arrived annually for the major festivals. The merchants sold sacrificial animals, incense, oil. Pliny the Elder records that the finest frankincense cost 6 denarii per pound and premium myrrh up to 50 denarii, more per weight than silver. The copper scroll discovered at Qumran, dating to the 1st century, lists 64 locations where temple treasure was allegedly hidden before the Roman destruction, totaling roughly 4,600 talents of gold and silver. If those numbers are even approximately accurate, the temple treasury held wealth equivalent to billions in modern currency, a sovereign wealth fund operating behind sacred walls. And the families who controlled this wealth were despised. The Talmud preserves a protest song that ordinary Jews sang about the priestly aristocracy, and the bitterness in it is raw even across 2,000 years. Woe to me because of the house of Boethus. Woe to me because of their clubs. Woe to me because of the house of Annas. Woe to me because of their whispering. Clubs and whispering, violence and conspiracy. The house of Annas, the same Annas who appears in John 18:13, as the power behind his son-in-law Caiaphas controlled the high priesthood through 5 of his own sons and Caiaphas himself. When Jesus stood before Annas in the middle of the night, he stood before the head of a dynasty that the common people of Jerusalem hated with a fury born of generations of exploitation. When you pray and feel that God seems distant, when you feel the institutions of faith have become entangled with money and power, you are feeling what a Jewish peasant felt walking past the temple treasury in 33 AD. The ache is not new, and the answer God sent was not a reform committee or a political revolution. The answer was a tecton from Nazareth who walked into the temple courts, looked at the entire machinery of religious commerce, and turned the tables over. But even the priestly aristocracy paled beside the true summit of power in this world. The high priest's vestments, The blue robe fringed with golden bells and pomegranate-shaped tassels, the ephod of gold, blue, purple and scarlet thread, the breastplate set with 12 precious stones, representing the 12 tribes. These garments were so politically potent that the Romans confiscated them. They kept them locked in the Antonia fortress overlooking the temple, releasing them only for festivals. Imagine that, the most sacred garments in Judaism held hostage in a Roman military installation. The message was unmistakable. Your worship exists at our pleasure. And above the Romans who held those garments, above the governor, above the legions, there sat one man. Augustus Caesar's estate at his death was calculated at approximately 100 million sesterces in bequests alone. The annual tax revenue of the entire empire under his rule reached 800 to 900 million sesterces. His personal inscription, the Res Gestae, carved on temple walls across the known world, declared that he had spent 2.4 billion sesterces of his own money on public works, military bonuses, and grain for the masses. The word Caesar became so synonymous with supreme power that it entered every European language as a title, Kaiser in German, Tsar in Russian. This was not merely political authority, it was economic omnipotence. A single family controlled an economy producing roughly $500 billion in modern equivalent across territories stretching from Spain to Syria. And the coin. Consider the coin. When Jesus asked for a denarius in Matthew chapter 22, when he held that small silver disc up to the light in the temple courts and asked whose image it bore, every eye could see the inscription, Tai Caesar Divi Avg F Avgstvs, Tiberius Caesar, son of the divine Augustus, and on the reverse, Pontiff Maxim, high priest, a graven image, which the Torah forbade, a claim of divinity which was blasphemy. Every Jew who touched that coin to pay a tax or buy bread was handling an object that violated the first two commandments simultaneously, and Jesus held it up and said, "Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and unto God what is God's." The crowd gasped, because the implication was shattering. Caesar's image is on this metal. But whose image is on you? You were made in the image of God. Render yourself to the one who made you. The most explosive political statement ever compressed into a single sentence, and it sailed past every trap they had set. Now I need you to see something. I need you to hold the entire spectrum in your mind at once. The beggar crouching at the pool of Bethesda, the day laborer earning his single denarius, the tecton cutting stone in Sepphoris, the centurion commanding his 80 men, the money changers in the temple courts, the high priest in his jeweled breastplate held hostage by Rome, the governor in his praetorium, the Caesar on his throne declaring himself divine. Every level, every rung. From the crouching beggar to the emperor who controlled the known world. And then I need you to see where Jesus placed himself on that ladder. He was born in a feeding trough. He grew up in a village so obscure that Nathanael could ask, "Can anything good come from Nazareth?" He worked with his hands. He owned nothing. He told a would-be follower that foxes have dens and birds have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head. He ate with the Am Haaretz, the people the rabbis called animals. He touched lepers, people required by Leviticus to tear their clothes, leave their hair unkempt, cover their faces and cry, "Unclean," to anyone who approached. Archaeological evidence confirms what Scripture describes. Skeletal remains showing leprosy lesions were buried in separate graves, apart from community cemeteries. These were people who experienced death before they died. Social death, relational death, the death of being seen and known and touched. And Jesus reached out his hand and touched them. He touched them first. Before the healing, before the miracle. The touch came first, and then came the final descent. Roman law classified crucifixion as servile supplicium, the punishment of slaves, not merely of criminals, of slaves. It was reserved for those at the absolute bottom of the social hierarchy: slaves, pirates, insurrectionists from conquered peoples. No Roman citizen could be crucified regardless of their crime. The cross was not just an instrument of death, it was a statement of status. To be crucified was to be publicly declared the lowest of the low, beneath every citizen, beneath every free person, beneath even the dignity of a human death. And the price they paid for him, 30 pieces of silver. This detail is so layered it takes your breath away. Exodus 21:32 established 30 shekels of silver as the compensation price for a slave killed by an ox. Not a free person, a slave. It was the assigned monetary value of a human life at its lowest legal reckoning. And then Zechariah, writing 500 years before Christ, recorded a bitter prophecy. The shepherd of Israel would be valued by the people at this handsome price, 30 pieces of silver, and the money would be thrown to the potter in the house of the Lord. When Judas negotiated with the chief priests in Matthew 26:15, they counted out exactly 30 silver coins. When Judas returned them in horror, the priests used them to buy a potter's field. A prophecy written half a millennium before its fulfillment, executed in precise detail by men who had no idea they were fulfilling it. The price of a slave, the value they placed on the Son of God. 120 denarii, 4 months' wages for a common laborer. That is what the shepherd of Israel was worth to the men who sold him. A tekton could have earned that in 60 days of cutting stone. Tell me in the comments, has there ever been a moment when the weight of what Jesus chose hit you in a way that changed how you see everything? Because here is the reality that wrecked me when I finally saw the full picture. Jesus did not merely descend from heaven to earth in some general theological sense. He descended through every specific layer of a brutally stratified society, and he did not stop until he had reached the bottom of every category that existed. Born into the working class, raised in an insignificant village, touching the untouchable, eating with the despised, valued at the price of a slave, executed by the method reserved for slaves. He did not just enter the human condition. He entered it at its lowest point and kept going. The excavation at Magdala, Mary Magdalene's hometown, completed in 2009, uncovered a first-century synagogue alongside the remains of the fish processing facilities that drove the local economy. Salting tanks, stone tables, drainage channels. Hundreds of workers labored there at subsistence wages, gutting and preserving fish from the Sea of Galilee for export across the region. Among them, or near them, lived a woman from whom Jesus would cast 7 demons. He found her in a town that smelled of fish and brine and poverty, and he set her free, and she became the first witness of his resurrection. The first announcement of the greatest event in history was entrusted not to a priest, not to a governor, not to a scribe, but to a woman from a fishing village that most of the world had never heard of. That is the pattern. That is the signature God leaves on everything he does. The Siloam Pool, excavated in 2004, stunned archaeologists with its scale. A monumental stepped structure measuring roughly 50 by 60 meters, with 3 sets of 5 steps descending into the water. This was the pool where Jesus sent the man born blind in John chapter 9. Go wash in the pool of Siloam. The blind beggar would have known every stone of that place. He had likely sat beside it for years, listening to the sound of pilgrims descending the steps for ritual purification before ascending to the temple. He could hear them going to worship. He could never see the temple they were going to. And Jesus put mud on his eyes. Mud, the simplest substance on earth, dirt and spit, the materials of creation itself, and sent him to wash in the waters of Siloam. Siloam means sent. The man who was sent to wash in the pool called sent was healed by the one who was himself sent by the Father. And when he could finally see, The first thing his new eyes witnessed was the temple rising above him in gold and white limestone against the Judean sky, the place he had spent a lifetime hearing and never seeing. The God who made eyes used mud to open them. The Creator recreated with the same materials he used the first time. I want you to pause here. I want you to feel the full weight of the world I have just described, a world where 75% of the population lived one bad harvest from starvation, where beggars crouched at public pools because there was no other medical system, where the religious elite called the common people animals, where a slave's life was valued at 30 pieces of silver, where the most powerful man on earth stamped his face on coins and called himself divine, where the high priest's sacred garments were held under lock and key in a Roman fortress. A world of crushing, systemic, inescapable inequality, not so different in its deepest structures from the one you navigate every day. Into that world, God did not send a political reformer. He did not send an economist. He did not send a military commander. He sent a tecton, a stonecutter's son from a village without a single monument, a man who walked an hour to work every morning, who knew the smell of limestone dust and sweat, who understood what it meant to earn your bread with cracked hands. And that man looked at the entire hierarchy, every level, every rung, from the crouching beggar to the enthroned emperor, and he said, "The last shall be first." He did not say it from above. He said it from below. He said it while kneeling on a floor with a towel around his waist, washing the dust from the feet of men who would abandon him before morning. He said it as a man who would be stripped naked, valued at a slave's price, and executed by a method so degrading that Roman law forbade its use on citizens. He said it from the cross, which was the lowest place in the lowest category of the lowest social system the ancient world had devised. The throne of the universe was a Roman cross, power absolute, disguised as weakness absolute. There is a thread that runs through everything I've shown you tonight, and I almost missed it the first time through. Mud, dust, stone, limestone under a tecton's hands, dust on the feet Jesus washed, mud on the eyes of the blind man, the stone rolled away from the tomb, the material world, the gritty, heavy physical world of labor and sweat and hunger, is not an obstacle to God's presence. It is the medium through which he works. He does not hover above the material. He enters it, he shapes it, he redeems it with his hands, and that means your work matters, your exhaustion matters, the calluses on your hands, the weight on your shoulders, the daily grind that sometimes feels so far from anything sacred. It is the very material God chose to inhabit. Jesus did not save the world from a throne room. He saved it from a construction site, a dusty road, a borrowed room, and a cross. If you have ever felt that God is far away, that your life is too ordinary, too burdened, too low on some invisible ladder for the divine to notice, I need you to hear this. The God who made the universe spent his childhood commuting to a construction job. He spent his ministry touching people that the religious establishment classified as subhuman. He was sold for the legal price of a slave. He died a death reserved for the lowest of the low. There is no rung beneath him. There is no depth he did not reach. There is no place in your life, and no failure, no shame, no exhaustion, no loneliness, where he was not there first, where his hands did not already grip the stone. The Theodotus inscription, carved in Greek before the destruction of the temple, records that a synagogue leader built a guest house with water installations for the lodging of those who come from abroad, hospitality for strangers, shelter for pilgrims who had nowhere to stay, carved in stone, preserved for 2,000 years, a quiet witness that even in a world of savage inequality, someone believed that the stranger at the gate deserved a roof and clean water. That impulse, the impulse to open the door, to make room, to see the image of God in the face of a person who has nothing, that impulse did not originate with human kindness. It originated with a God who made himself a stranger. who was born with no room at the inn, who died outside the city walls. Every act of mercy you have ever offered, every meal shared, every door opened, every hand extended to someone crouching in the dust, participates in the same movement, the same downward trajectory, the same voluntary descent from glory to service that began before the foundation of the world and found its fullest expression on a Friday afternoon in Jerusalem, when the one who held all things together allowed himself to be held by nails. Stone, bread, dust, water, blood. These are not metaphors. These are the materials of salvation. If this journey through the biblical world has opened your eyes to something you had not seen before, I hope you will walk with me further. There are more layers to uncover, more excavations to visit, more ancient texts that confirm what faith has always known. Subscribe, and we will keep going together, deeper into the world that God entered, not from above, but from the very bottom, with calloused hands and dust on his feet, carrying the weight of every life that ever crouched in fear and whispered into the dark, hoping someone was listening. Someone was. Someone is.